Imagine a universe where humanity is considered the most dangerous species, not because of our weapons or technology, but because of something far more terrifying to alien civilizations: our ability to create bonds with anyone, anywhere, anytime. What happens when a hardened human smuggler, carrying illegal cargo through the most restricted space in the galaxy, encounters a starving alien child whose species has been taught that humans are monsters? What happens when that same human reaches into his emergency supplies and offers the one thing that could change everything: a simple bar of chocolate? This is the story of how humanity's greatest weapon isn't destruction, but connection. How a single act of kindness can topple empires, unite enemies, and prove that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe isn't found in the barrel of a gun, but in the warmth of an open hand. Some say humans are crazy. Others say we're dangerous. But what they don't understand is that our true power lies in something they've forgotten how to do: care for each other, even when it makes no logical sense. This is the story of Captain Jake Morrison, a chocolate bar, and how one small moment of human compassion ignited a revolution that would reshape the galaxy forever. Captain Jake Morrison pressed his back against the cold metal wall of the abandoned mining station, his breathing steady despite the circumstances. The cargo hold of his ship, the Wandering Star, contained enough contraband to earn him a life sentence in any of the 17 Allied systems. Medical supplies, food synthesizers, and communication equipment, all desperately needed by the outer colonies, all strictly forbidden by the Galactic Trade Consortium. The station's corridors stretched out in darkness around him, illuminated only by the emergency lighting that cast eerie red shadows on the walls. According to his intel, this place had been empty for 3 standard years, ever since the Consortium had declared the entire sector off-limits to civilian traffic. What they hadn't mentioned was why. Jake's scanner beeped softly, indicating movement somewhere in the lower levels. He cursed under his breath. His contact should have been here 2 hours ago, and every minute he stayed increased his chances of being discovered by Consortium patrol. The Outer Rim was crawling with their ships these days, all part of some new security initiative that nobody seemed to understand. He made his way through the station's maze-like interior, following the maintenance tunnels that his contact had described. The place had an oppressive atmosphere, as if something terrible had happened here. The walls bore scorch marks in places, and Jake noticed several sections where metal panels had been ripped away from their mountings with tremendous force. As he descended deeper into the station, the temperature began to drop. His breath formed small clouds in the increasingly frigid air, and he pulled his jacket tighter around himself. The scanner indicated that the movement was coming from just ahead, around a corner that led to what his ship's database indicated was a storage area. Jake drew his sidearm, a reliable plasma pistol that had saved his life more times than he cared to count. He moved carefully around the corner, weapon raised, prepared for anything, except what he actually found. Huddled in the corner of the storage room was a small figure, no more than 4 feet tall, with distinctive blue-gray skin and the elongated limbs characteristic of the Zephyrian species. The creature was clearly young, probably no more than a child by their species standards, and it appeared to be in terrible condition. Its clothing was torn and dirty, and Jake could see that it was shivering violently in the cold. The young Zephyrian noticed Jake's approach and immediately pressed itself further into the corner, its large, dark eyes wide with terror. It began making a series of high-pitched sounds that Jake's universal translator couldn't quite process. Either the device was malfunctioning, or the creature was too frightened to speak coherently. Jake slowly lowered his weapon, holding his hands up in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. He had encountered Zephyrians before, though usually only in official capacity as traders or diplomats. They were known throughout the galaxy as a highly intelligent and peaceful species, with a natural aptitude for mathematics and engineering that made them valuable allies of the Consortium. "Hey there," Jake said softly, keeping his voice as gentle as possible. "I'm not going to hurt you. What are you doing here, little one?" The young Zephyrian's translator seemed to be working because it stopped making the frightened sounds and instead spoke in heavily accented Standard Galactic. Please don't hurt Crix. Crix has done nothing wrong. Crix is just lost." Jake felt his heart sink. The creature, Crix, was obviously terrified, and given the horror stories that circulated about human behavior in some parts of the galaxy, he couldn't entirely blame the kid. Humans had a reputation that ranged from unpredictably dangerous to completely psychotic, depending on which species you asked. The fact that most of these stories were exaggerated or completely fabricated didn't make them any less real to those who believed them. "I'm not going to hurt you, Crix," Jake repeated, crouching down to make himself less threatening. "My name is Jake. How long have you been here?" Crix's eyes darted nervously between Jake's face and his holstered weapon. "Many cycles." Crix lost count. The bad ships came to Crix's home. Crix hid in the cargo hold, but when Crix came out, Crix was here, all alone. Jake's blood ran cold as he began to understand what had happened. Zephyrian colonies had been disappearing from the outer rim for months, their populations simply vanishing without a trace. The consortium claimed they were voluntary relocations, part of a new settlement program, but smugglers like Jake knew better. Someone was raiding these colonies, and from the sound of it, Crix had been caught in one of these attacks. "Are you hurt?" Jake asked, noticing how the young Zephyrian favored one leg over the other. Crix shook his head quickly, though the gesture was clearly a lie. "Crix is fine. Crix is strong. But Crix is very hungry. No food here for many cycles." Jake's heart clenched as he looked at the pitiful figure before him. Crix couldn't weigh more than 60 pounds, and it was obvious that he had been surviving on whatever scraps he could find in the abandoned station. His large eyes were sunken, and his movements were weak and unsteady. Without thinking, Jake reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his emergency ration pack. It contained several high-energy bars, a water purification tablet, and a small chocolate bar that he always carried for luck. His grandmother had given him his first chocolate bar when he was about Crix's age, and he had maintained the tradition ever since. Crix flinched when Jake moved, clearly expecting violence, but instead found a chocolate bar being offered to him. The young Zephyrian stared at the brown rectangle in confusion, his head tilted to one side in the characteristic Zephyrian expression of puzzlement. "It's food," Jake explained gently. "Chocolate. It's safe for your species to eat. I've seen Zephyrian traders enjoy it before. Go ahead, try it." Crix reached out hesitantly and took the chocolate bar with trembling fingers. He examined it carefully, sniffing it with his sensitive nose before taking a tiny, experimental bite. Jake watched as the young alien's expression changed from suspicion to surprise to absolute wonder. This is amazing," Crix exclaimed, his eyes lighting up with genuine joy for the first time since Jake had found him. "What is this wonderful food? It tastes like sunshine and happiness." Despite the gravity of the situation, Jake couldn't help but smile. "It's called chocolate. Humans make it from plants that grow on our homeworld. I'm glad you like it." Crix devoured the rest of the chocolate bar with obvious relish, and Jake could see some color returning to his pale blue cheeks. The young Zephyrian looked up at him with something approaching trust, though there was still wariness in his large eyes. "Why does the human Jake give food to Crix?" the young alien asked. Crix was told that humans are dangerous. That humans hurt other species for sport. Jake felt a familiar anger rising in his chest. Not at Crix, but at whoever had filled the kid's head with such nonsense. "Humans aren't monsters, Crix. We're just people like Zephyrians are people. Some humans are bad, just like some Zephyrians are bad, but most of us just want to live our lives in peace." Crix considered this for a moment, his head tilted in thought. Jake is not like the stories say. Jake gives food instead of pain. Jake speaks gently instead of shouting. Maybe the stories are wrong. Maybe they are, Jake agreed. He handed Crix one of the energy bars from his ration pack. "Here, eat this too. You need to get your strength back." As Crix ate the energy bar with obvious hunger, Jake activated his ship's communication system. He had originally come to the station to complete a smuggling run, but that plan had just changed dramatically. He couldn't leave a child alone on an abandoned station, especially not one who had clearly been through such trauma. "Wandering Star, this is Morrison," he said into his comm unit. "Change of plans. I'm bringing a passenger aboard." The response came from his ship's AI, a sophisticated program that Jake had named Sarah after his late sister. "Captain, I should remind you that we are currently carrying illegal cargo through restricted space. Adding a passenger significantly increases our risk of detection." "I know the risks, Sarah," Jake replied, "but I'm not leaving a kid out here to die. Prep the guest quarters and run a full medical scan protocol. Our passenger is a young Zephyrian who's been without proper food and medical care for several days." "Understood, Captain. However, I feel obligated to point out that harboring a Zephyrian refugee could add charges of alien trafficking to your already considerable legal troubles. Jake glanced at Crix, who was listening to this exchange with obvious interest despite the language barrier posed by some of Jake's more technical terminology. Sometimes doing the right thing means accepting the consequences, Sarah. Besides, something tells me there's more to this situation than just a lost kid. He turned back to Crix, who had finished the energy bar and was looking somewhat stronger. Crix, I'm going to take you somewhere safe, okay? My ship isn't far from here. The young Zephyrian's eyes widened with a mixture of hope and fear. Jake will not hurt Crix? Jake will not sell Crix to the bad ships. The casual mention of being sold sent another chill down Jake's spine. Whatever had happened to Crix's colony, it was clearly part of something larger and more sinister than simple relocation. I promise I won't hurt you, and I definitely won't sell you to anyone. You have my word. Jake helped Crix to his feet, noting how the young alien struggled with balance. His injured leg was clearly causing him significant pain, though he was trying to hide it. Jake made a mental note to have Sarah run a thorough medical evaluation once they were aboard the ship. As they made their way through the station's corridors, Crix stayed close to Jake's side, occasionally glancing up at him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to lingering fear. Jake found himself talking to fill the silence, telling Crix about his ship and his crew, though he was careful to avoid mentioning the illegal nature of his cargo. Sarah is my ship's computer, Jake explained as they walked. She's very smart, and she'll help take care of you while we figure out what happened to your colony. She might seem a bit cold at first, but that's just her programming. She means well. Crix has never been on a human ship, the young Zephyrian admitted. Crix's parents said human ships are full of weapons and dangerous things. Well, my ship does have weapons, Jake said honestly, but only for protection. The galaxy can be a dangerous place, and sometimes you need to be able to defend yourself. But the Wandering Star is also full of books and music and games. I think you might like it. They reached the docking bay where Jake's ship was berthed, and he could see Crix's eyes widen as he took in the sleek lines of the modified cargo hauler. The Wandering Star wasn't the largest ship in Jake's fleet, but it was his favorite, fast, reliable, and equipped with some of the best stealth systems money could buy. As they boarded the ship, Jake activated the medical bay and gestured for Crix to lie down on the examination table. Sarah needs to scan you to make sure you're not seriously injured, he explained. It won't hurt, I promise. The medical scanners hummed to life, bathing Crix in a soft blue light as they analyzed his condition. Jake watched the readouts with growing concern. The young Zephyrian was severely malnourished and dehydrated, and there were signs of old injuries that hadn't healed properly. Captain, Sarah's voice filled the medical bay. The patient shows signs of prolonged starvation and neglect. There are also indicators of physical trauma consistent with violent handling. I recommend immediate nutritional support and bed rest. Jake felt his jaw clench as he processed this information. Whatever had happened to Crix's colony, it clearly hadn't been the peaceful relocation that the consortium claimed. Someone had hurt this child, and Jake was beginning to suspect that someone had significant resources and official backing. Start him on a gentle rehydration protocol, Jake instructed, and prepare some light meals that won't shock his system. We need to get his strength back, gradually. As Sarah began administering treatment, Jake noticed that Crix was watching him with an expression of amazement. Jake cares for Crix like family, the young alien said softly. Why does Jake do this? Crix is nothing to Jake. Jake sat down next to the examination table, choosing his words carefully. Where I come from, Crix, we believe that everyone deserves kindness and help when they need it. It doesn't matter if you're human or Zephyrian or any other species. What matters is that you're alone and scared and hungry, and I can do something about that. Crix was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Finally, he looked up at Jake with eyes that seemed far too old for such a young face. Crix wants to tell Jake something important, something about the bad ships and what happened to Crix's people. Jake leaned forward, his attention focused entirely on the young Zephyrian. He had a feeling that whatever Crix was about to tell him would change everything, not just about this rescue, but about the entire situation in the Outer Rim. What happened, Crix? Jake asked gently. Tell me everything you remember. As the young alien began to speak, recounting the attack on his colony in halting, painful detail, Jake realized that he had stumbled into something much larger than a simple smuggling run. The chocolate bar that had begun this conversation had opened a door to secrets that powerful people clearly wanted to keep hidden. And Jake Morrison had never been one to back down from a fight, especially when it involved protecting someone who couldn't protect themselves. Crick's story unfolded slowly, interrupted by moments when the memories became too painful for him to continue. Jake listened with growing horror as the young Zephyrian described the attack on Colony 7, his home for the first 12 years of his life. The ships came in the dark cycle, Crix whispered, his large eyes staring at something far beyond the walls of the medical bay. Big ships with no markings. They surrounded the colony before anyone could send warnings. Papa tried to use the communication array, but the signals were blocked. Jake handed Crix a cup of warm broth that Sarah had prepared, nutritionally balanced for Zephyrian physiology. The young alien wrapped his thin fingers around the cup gratefully, drawing warmth from the surface. What do the ships look like? Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Black metal, very smooth. And quiet. Papa said they must have very advanced engines to move so silently. They had symbols on them, but Crix couldn't read them. Red symbols that looked like... Crix paused, struggling to find the right words. Like a bird with sharp claws, holding a star. Jake's blood went cold. The symbol Crix described belonged to Blackstone Industries, one of the most powerful corporations in the galaxy and a major contractor for the Galactic Trade Consortium. Officially, Blackstone provided security services and resource extraction. Unofficially, rumors persisted about their involvement in less savory activities. Tell me about the people who came off the ships, Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. Crix took a sip of broth before continuing. They wore armor like Consortium peacekeepers, but different colors. Dark green instead of blue. They had weapons that made no sound when they fired, but they put people to sleep. Mama fell down after being hit by one of their beams, and she wouldn't wake up no matter how much Crix shook her. The young Zephyrian's voice broke on the last words, and Jake could see tears forming in his large eyes. Jake reached out instinctively to comfort him, then stopped, remembering that physical contact could be threatening to traumatized children of any species. It's okay, Jake said softly. You're safe now, Crix. Take your time. After a few minutes, Crix continued his account. The soldiers gathered everyone in the main square. All the families, even the babies. They said they were relocating everyone to better worlds, worlds where Zephyrians would have more opportunities. But Crix heard Papa talking to Uncle Vex, and Papa was very scared. What did your Papa say? Jake prompted gently. Papa said the numbers were wrong. The soldiers claimed they were taking everyone to new colonies, but they only had enough transport for half the people. Papa asked what would happen to the rest, and the soldier leader just smiled. It was not a nice smile. Jake felt his hands clench into fists. The picture Crix was painting was becoming clearer, and it was far worse than anything Jake had imagined. This wasn't relocation. It was slave trading on a massive scale, with the consortium's apparent knowledge and approval. How did you escape? Jake asked. Crix's eyes brightened slightly at this part of the story. Crix was hiding in the storage building when the soldiers came. Crix is very good at hiding. Papa always said Crix was too curious for his own good, always sneaking around where he shouldn't. When the soldiers loaded people onto the ships, Crix snuck into one of the cargo holds. That was very brave of you, Jake said, and he meant it. For a child of 12 to have the presence of mind to hide, and then Stowaway took remarkable courage and intelligence. Crix wanted to stay with family, the young Zephyrian replied simply. But the cargo hold was full of other things. Machines and boxes and other people who were sleeping like Mama. People from other colonies, other worlds, all crammed together like cargo. Jake's stomach churned as he processed this information. Blackstone wasn't just raiding Zephyrian colonies. They were running a systematic operation across multiple systems, harvesting entire populations for the slave markets that officially didn't exist, but were well known to anyone who operated outside the law. What happened when the ship reached its destination? Jake asked. Crix shivered, pulling the medical blanket tighter around himself. The ship stopped at a big station, bigger than Colony 7. Crix could hear the soldiers talking about processing and shipment schedules. They were going to sort people by age and skills, send them to different buyers. But before they could unload the cargo, alarms started sounding. Alarms. Yes, very loud. And lights flashing everywhere. The soldiers were running and shouting. Something about consortium inspectors arriving for a surprise audit. The ship left very quickly, so quickly that they forgot to check all the cargo holds. When Crix finally came out, the ship was empty and docked at the old mining station. Jake leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. A surprise consortium audit had inadvertently saved Crix's life, but it also suggested that not everyone in the consortium was aware of Blackstone's activities. There might be officials within the government who were genuinely trying to investigate the disappearing colonies. Crix, Jake said carefully, do you remember anything else about the station where your people were taken? Any names or identification codes? The young Zephyrian thought for a moment. The soldiers mentioned a place called Terminus Station. They said it was the best processing facility in Sector 9, very efficient. And they talked about someone called the Overseer, someone who paid very well for quality merchandise. Jake activated his ship's computer interface, pulling up star charts and shipping records. Terminus Station was listed in the official databases as a legitimate commercial hub, but Jake knew that many of the worst criminal operations hid behind legitimate facades. Sarah, he said aloud, cross-reference Blackstone Industries with Terminus Station. Look for any connection, no matter how buried. Processing, Captain, Sarah replied. Preliminary search indicates that Blackstone leases significant storage and processing facilities at Terminus Station through a series of subsidiary companies. The lease agreements are heavily encrypted and classified. Can you break the encryption? Not without significant risk of detection. However, I can compile a list of ships that have visited Terminus Station in the past 6 months. Cross-referencing with missing colony reports might provide useful intelligence. As Sarah worked, Jake turned his attention back to Crix. The young Zephyrian had finished his broth and was looking significantly better, though exhaustion was clearly taking its toll. Crix, you've been incredibly brave, and you've given me very important information, Jake said. But now I need you to rest while I figure out what to do next. Sarah will monitor your condition and wake me if you need anything. Crix nodded, but as Jake moved to leave the medical bay, the young alien called out to him. Jake, will you try to help Crix's family? Crix knows it's dangerous, but Jake stopped and turned back to face him. The hope and desperation in Crix's eyes was heartbreaking, but Jake also knew that what the young Zephyrian was asking could be a death sentence for both of them. Going up against Blackstone Industries and their consortium backing would require resources and allies that a simple smuggler didn't have. On the other hand, Jake had never been able to walk away from someone who needed help. I'll see what I can do, Jake promised. But first, we need to get you somewhere safe. I have friends who can take care of you while I investigate this situation. Crix wants to help, the young alien said firmly. Crix knows things about the bad ships, about how they operate. Crix can be useful. Jake shook his head. You're 12 years old, Crix. Your job is to be safe and let the adults handle this. Crix is not a baby, the young Zephyrian protested, his large eyes flashing with determination. Crix survived alone for many cycles. Crix can help rescue family and friends. The argument was interrupted by an urgent chime from the ship's alert system. Sarah's voice filled the medical bay with barely concealed alarm. Captain, I'm detecting 3 ships approaching our position at high speed. Configuration suggests consortium patrol vessels. Jake cursed under his breath. The last thing he needed was an inspection while carrying illegal cargo and harboring a refugee that powerful people clearly wanted to keep quiet. How long until they reach us? He asked, already moving toward the bridge. Approximately 8 minutes at current velocity. They are broadcasting standard inspection codes, but their approach vector suggests they know exactly where to find us. Jake's mind raced through the possibilities. Either this was an incredibly unlucky coincidence, or someone had tracked him to this location. Given what Crix had told him about Blackstone's operations, he suspected the latter. Sarah, initiate emergency protocols. Secure all contraband cargo and prepare the hidden compartments. We're about to have company. As Jake reached the bridge, he could see the approaching ships on his tactical display. 3 sleek patrol vessels flying in perfect formation. They were still too far away to get detailed scans, but their configuration suggested they were well-armed and experienced. Crix, Jake called over the ship's communication system. I need you to stay in the medical bay and keep quiet, no matter what happens. Can you do that for me? Yes, Jake, came the reply, though Jake could hear the fear in the young alien's voice. Jake settled into the pilot's seat and activated the ship's communication array. Whatever was about to happen, he would need to play this very carefully. If the approaching ships were legitimate consortium patrol vessels, he might be able to bluff his way through an inspection. But if they were Blackstone operatives looking for cricks, things were about to get very dangerous. Unknown vessels. This is Captain Morrison of the merchant vessel Wandering Star. He broadcast on standard frequencies. Please state your business and intentions. The response came immediately, spoken in the clipped, professional tones of a consortium military officer. Captain Morrison, this is Commander Torres of the CPS Vindication. We are conducting a routine inspection of all vessels in this sector under Emergency Directive 447. Prepare to be boarded. Jake had never heard of Emergency Directive 447, which was suspicious in itself. He also noticed that none of the approaching ships had responded with their normal identification codes, another red flag. Sarah, he whispered, analyze the voice pattern of that transmission. Does it match any known consortium officers? Negative, Captain. The vocal patterns do not match any officer in my database. Additionally, the speech patterns suggest the use of voice modification technology. Jake felt his heart sink. These weren't consortium patrol ships. They were Blackstone operatives, and they were here for cricks. Somehow, they had tracked the young Zephyrian to this location, and they weren't planning on taking any prisoners. He activated the ship's defensive systems and began plotting a course away from the mining station. The Wandering Star was fast, but she wasn't built for combat against multiple patrol vessels. His only hope was to reach the asteroid field at the edge of the system, where his superior knowledge of local space might give him an advantage. Commander Torres, Jay transmitted, I'm experiencing technical difficulties with my docking systems. Request permission to complete repairs before inspection. Negative, Wandering Star. Shut down your engines immediately and prepare to be boarded. Any attempt to flee will be considered an act of piracy. Jake didn't bother to respond. Instead, he activated the ship's engine systems and pushed them to maximum power. The Wandering Star leaped forward like a startled animal, racing away from the mining station toward the relative safety of open space. Behind them, the three patrol ships immediately changed course to pursue, and Jake could see weapon systems coming online. Whatever cover story they had been planning to use was apparently forgotten. They were now openly hostile. Hold on, cricks, Jake called out as he threw the ship into a series of evasive maneuvers. This is going to get rough. The first energy blasts erupted around them moments later, brilliant flashes of light that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. Jake pushed the ship's engines harder, coaxing every bit of speed from the modified drives while simultaneously activating every defensive system the Wandering Star possessed. Sarah, what's our status? He demanded as another volley of shots passed dangerously close to their hull. Engines at 112% of rated capacity. Defensive shields holding at 85%. However, Captain, our pursuers are gaining. We will be within effective weapons range in approximately 4 minutes. Jake gritted his teeth and continued his desperate flight toward the asteroid field. Behind him, a young alien who had already lost everything was counting on him to keep them both alive long enough to expose the truth about what was happening in the Outer Rim. The next few minutes would determine whether that truth would ever see the light of day, or whether both of them would simply disappear like so many others before them. The asteroid field loomed ahead like a three-dimensional maze of tumbling rock and ice, each piece ranging from the size of a small building to chunks large enough to have their own gravity wells. Jake had navigated these particular asteroids dozens of times during his smuggling runs, using them as cover from consortium patrols. Today, he hoped that intimate knowledge would be enough to keep them alive. Sarah, activate the proximity sensors and prepare for manual navigation, Jake ordered as the first massive asteroids began to fill their view screen. I'm taking us in deep. Captain, I must advise against this course of action, Sarah responded, her synthetic voice carrying what might have been concern if she were capable of such emotions. The asteroid density in this field exceeds safe navigation parameters. Even with our enhanced sensors, the probability of collision is I know the risks. Jake cut her off, throwing the ship into a sharp turn that brought them between two massive chunks of spinning rock. But those ships behind us aren't planning to take us alive. Sometimes you have to choose between probable death and certain death. Through the communication system, Jake could hear Crick's whimpering in the medical bay. The young Zephyrian had probably never experienced anything like this level of violent acceleration and maneuvering, and Jake made a mental note to check on him as soon as they were out of immediate danger. The pursuing ships followed them into the asteroid field, but Jake could see immediately that their pilots weren't familiar with this particular navigation challenge. The lead ship had to brake hard to avoid collision with a house-sized chunk of ice, allowing the wandering star to open up some distance. Jake pushed his ship deeper into the field, threading between asteroids with a precision that came from years of experience and more than a little desperation. He knew every major formation in this section, every safe passage, and dangerous trap. The pursuing ships were flying blind by comparison, forced to rely entirely on their sensors and automated navigation systems. "Warning," Sarah announced. "Multiple missile locks detected. The enemy vessels are preparing to fire." Jake's heart sank. He had hoped that the asteroid field would make targeting too difficult for effective missile use, but apparently these ships had more sophisticated weapons than he had anticipated. Military-grade missiles with advanced guidance systems could track targets even in cluttered environments like asteroid fields. Countermeasures, Jake ordered, activating every defensive system the wandering star possessed. Chaff dispensers fired clouds of metallic particles designed to confuse tracking systems, while electronic warfare suites began broadcasting false sensor signals in an attempt to spoof incoming missiles. The first volley of missiles streaked through the asteroid field like angry hornets, weaving between chunks of rock with deadly precision. Jake watched their approach on his tactical display, calculating intercept courses and evasion possibilities with a desperate clarity that came from having no other choice. "Hold on," he shouted, throwing the ship into a corkscrewing dive that brought them dangerously close to a spinning asteroid the size of a small moon. The missiles followed, but Jake had timed his maneuver perfectly. 2 of the 6 incoming weapons couldn't adjust their course quickly enough and detonated against the asteroid's surface in brilliant explosions that lit up the surrounding space. The remaining 4 missiles continued their pursuit, but Jake wasn't finished. He activated the ship's emergency boost system, a modification that fed raw plasma directly into the engines for a brief but spectacular increase in velocity. The wandering star shot forward like a bullet, racing between asteroids at speeds that would have been suicidal under normal circumstances. 3 more missiles lost tracking in the maze of spinning rock, their guidance systems confused by the chaotic sensor environment. The final missile closed to within 50 meters before its proximity fuse activated, sending a wave of energy and debris against the wandering star's shields. "Shield status," Jake demanded as the ship shuddered from the impact. 42% and falling, Sarah replied. However, the enemy vessels appear to be having navigation difficulties. 2 have suffered minor collisions with asteroid debris, and the 3rd has been forced to reduce speed significantly. Jake allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. His gamble was paying off. The asteroid field was proving too challenging for pilots who weren't familiar with its particular hazards. But he knew that his advantage was temporary. Eventually, the pursuing ships would either find a way around the field or simply wait for him to emerge. "Captain," Sarah continued, "I'm receiving a transmission from one of the enemy vessels. They're requesting communication." Jake considered ignoring the transmission, but curiosity got the better of him. Whatever these people wanted with Crix, it was clearly important enough to risk exposing their operation by pursuing him into the asteroid field. He might as well find out what they were willing to offer. "Put them through," he said, preparing himself for whatever threats or bribes might be coming. The voice that came through the communication system was smooth and professional, with the kind of practice charm that Jake associated with corporate executives and professional liars. "Captain Morrison, this is Director Walsh of Blackstone Industries. I believe we may have gotten off on the wrong foot." Jake nearly laughed at the understatement. "You think shooting missiles at my ship qualifies as getting off on the wrong foot?" "I apologize for the aggressive tactics of my security team," Walsh replied, sounding genuinely contrite. "They were operating under the assumption that you were aware of the illegal nature of your passenger and were attempting to evade legitimate authorities. I assure you that was not our intention." "Funny," Jake said, maneuvering around another asteroid cluster. "Your security team was awfully quick to start shooting for people who just wanted to chat." Walsh's tone became more serious. "Captain, we both know that you're harboring a refugee from a classified relocation operation. The young Zephyrian in your possession is a material witness to sensitive security matters. We're prepared to compensate you handsomely for his return, with no questions asked about your other business activities." Jake felt his anger building. Walsh was talking about Crix like he was a piece of cargo rather than a traumatized child who had lost everything. What kind of compensation are we talking about? 1 million standard credits, transferred to an account of your choosing, plus a full pardon for any smuggling charges that might be filed against you. That's a very generous offer, Captain. Far more generous than what usually happens to people who interfere with Blackstone operations. The threat was delivered with the same smooth professionalism as the rest of Walsh's pitch, but Jake had no trouble hearing the steel underneath. Blackstone was offering him a fortune to hand over Crix, but they were also making it clear that refusal would have consequences. And what happens to the kid? Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The refugee will be processed according to standard protocols. He'll be relocated to a facility where he can receive proper care and education. I assure you that Blackstone Industries takes excellent care of our relocated populations. Jake's stomach turned. Walsh was describing Crix's sale into slavery with the same tone he might use to discuss quarterly profit reports. The casual dehumanization of an entire people was apparently just another business practice for Blackstone. Counteroffer, Jake said, bringing his ship around the dark side of a particularly large asteroid. How about you and your ship's turn around and pretend you never saw me? In exchange, I won't broadcast what I know about your relocation operations to every news service in the galaxy. Walsh's laugh was cold and completely humorless. Captain, I think you overestimate your position. You're alone in an asteroid field with a damaged ship, being pursued by 3 military-grade patrol vessels. Even if you somehow manage to escape, Blackstone has connections throughout the consortium. We can make you disappear as easily as we made those colonies disappear. Maybe, Jake acknowledged, but I've got something you want, and you've already exposed your operation by chasing me out here. How many legitimate consortium patrols open fire without warning? How many use unmarked ships with voice scramblers? There was a long pause before Walsh responded, and when he did, his voice had lost all pretense of friendliness. You have 30 seconds to surrender, Captain Morrison. After that, my security team has orders to disable your ship by any means necessary. I should warn you that any means necessary doesn't necessarily include keeping you alive. The transmission ended, leaving Jake alone with the sound of his ship's engines and the irregular pinging of proximity alarms as they navigated through the asteroid field. He had 30 seconds to decide between taking Blackstone's money and fighting a battle he probably couldn't win. Sarah, he said quietly, what are our tactical options? Limited, Captain. Our weapons are designed for self-defense against pirates, not military engagement with patrol vessels. However, I have been analyzing the enemy ship's movement patterns, and I believe I can predict their optimal firing positions. Jake's mind raced through possibilities. The Wandering Star wasn't a warship, but she had been modified over the years with various defensive and offensive capabilities that weren't exactly legal in most systems. Jake had always believed that it was better to have weapons you didn't need than to need weapons you didn't have. What about the mining charges in Cargo Bay 3? He asked. The industrial mining explosives? Captain, those are designed for asteroid excavation, not combat. Using them as weapons would be extremely dangerous and completely unpredictable. Unpredictable might be exactly what we need, Jake muttered, studying the tactical display. Sarah, can you rig those charges to detonate on a remote signal? Theoretically, yes. However, I must stress that the risk to our own ship would be considerable. The blast radius of each charge is designed to fracture large asteroid formations. Jake looked at the asteroid field around them with new eyes. The massive chunks of rock weren't just cover. They were potential weapons if he was desperate enough to use them that way. And, right now, with Crix's life hanging in the balance, Jake was feeling very desperate indeed. Do it, he ordered. Rig the charges for remote detonation, and prepare to jettison them on my command. We're going to give Director Walsh and his security team a lesson in the dangers of operating in unfamiliar territory. As Sarah worked to reprogram the mining charges, Jake continued threading his way through the asteroid field, leading his pursuers deeper into the maze of spinning rock. Behind him, the 3 Blackstone ships were closing the distance, their weapons systems armed and targeting solutions locked. Jake smiled grimly as he positioned his ship near the largest asteroid formation in the field, a cluster of massive rocks held together by gravitational forces and the occasional collision. If his plan worked, Director Walsh was about to learn that humans didn't just fight with weapons. They fought with their environment, their creativity, and their absolute refusal to surrender when defending the innocent. If his plan didn't work, then both he and Crix would become just another casualty in Blackstone's ruthless expansion across the Outer Rim. Either way, the next few minutes would determine the fate of everyone aboard the Wandering Star. The explosion that followed Jake's desperate gambit was visible from 3 star systems away. When the mining charges detonated against the massive asteroid cluster, the carefully balanced gravitational forces that held the formation together collapsed in a spectacular cascade of destruction. Chunks of rock the size of buildings careened through space in all directions, while smaller debris created a deadly cloud of high-velocity projectiles. Jake had positioned the Wandering Star on the far side of the largest asteroid, using its bulk as a shield against the worst of the blast. The Blackstone ships, caught in the open while pursuing him, had no such protection. The lead vessel took a direct hit from a chunk of rock the size of a cargo container, its shields flaring and failing under the impact. The ship spun wildly before its pilot managed to regain control, but Jake could see atmosphere venting from multiple hull breaches. The second ship managed to avoid the larger debris, but was pelted by smaller rocks moving at tremendous velocity. Its hull was scarred and pitted, and one of its weapon arrays had been completely destroyed. The pilot was clearly struggling to maintain course through the chaos. Only the third ship emerged relatively unscathed, its pilot having had the skill and reflexes to find cover behind a nearby asteroid when the explosions began. But even that ship was now dealing with a drastically changed tactical situation, as the asteroid field had become exponentially more dangerous and unpredictable. Damage report, Jake called out as he guided his ship through the aftermath of the explosion. Minor hull scoring from debris impacts, Sarah reported. Shields at 18%, but regenerating. However, Captain, I'm detecting new ships approaching from the edge of the system. 3 vessels. Configuration suggests they are actual consortium patrol ships. Jake's heart sank. He had hoped to deal with the Blackstone ships before any legitimate authorities arrived, but apparently luck wasn't on his side today. Fighting corporate mercenaries was one thing. Engaging actual consortium military vessels would make him an outlaw with no hope of clearing his name. Time to intercept? He asked, already plotting escape routes out of the system. Approximately 12 minutes. However, Captain, I'm receiving a transmission from the lead consortium vessel. The message is coded with Intelligence Service identifiers. Jake frowned. Intelligence Service involvement suggested that this situation was even more complicated than he had realized. He activated the communication array, hoping that whoever was coming would at least listen to his side of the story before shooting. Unknown vessel. This is Commander Sarah Chun of the CNS Intrepid, came a crisp, professional voice. Please identify yourself and state your business in this system. Jake glanced at his tactical display, noting that the surviving Blackstone ships were regrouping and moving to intercept the approaching consortium vessels. Director Walsh was apparently planning to brazen this out, possibly by claiming that Jake was the real criminal and that Blackstone had been trying to apprehend him. Commander Chun, this is Captain Morrison of the merchant vessel Wandering Star, Jake transmitted. I'm currently under attack by ships claiming to be consortium patrol vessels, but I believe they're actually corporate mercenaries engaged in illegal activities. The response came immediately. Captain Morrison, maintain your current position. We're tracking multiple hostile vessels in your vicinity and moving to investigate. Do not, repeat, do not engage unless fired upon. Jake breathed a sigh of relief. Chen's tone suggested that she was at least willing to listen to his explanation before making any judgments. That was more than he had expected from consortium military. Sarah, Jake said quietly, scan the approaching consortium ships. Are they really intelligence service? Confirmed, Captain. Ship configurations match Consortium Intelligence Division specifications, and their identification codes check out against official databases. However, I should note that one of the Blackstone vessels is moving to intercept them. Jake watched his tactical display as the damaged Blackstone ships regrouped and began moving toward the approaching consortium vessels. Whatever Director Walsh was planning, it was clearly desperate. Engaging actual consortium military would expose Blackstone's operation completely. Unless Walsh had something Jake didn't know about. The first exchange of fire between the Blackstone and consortium ships lit up space with energy beams and missile trails. Jake was shocked to see that the Blackstone vessels were holding their own against superior numbers, their weapons apparently more advanced than standard corporate security equipment. "Captain," Sarah announced, "I'm receiving a priority transmission from the young Zephyrian in the medical bay. He appears to be quite distressed by the combat noises." Jake cursed under his breath. In all the excitement of the running battle, he had forgotten about Crix. The young alien was probably terrified, listening to explosions and weapons fire while locked in the medical bay with no idea what was happening. "Transfer the transmission to my headset," Jake ordered, switching his communications to a private channel while continuing to monitor the tactical situation. "Jake," came Crix's frightened voice. "What is happening? Why are there so many loud noises?" "We're in a fight, Crix," Jake explained, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring. "The bad ships found us, but help is coming. I need you to stay in the medical bay and keep safe, okay?" "Crix is scared," the young Zephyrian admitted. But Crix trusts Jake. Jake saved Crix when no one else would. Jake felt a surge of determination. This child had already lost everything once: family, home, security. Jake would be damned if he let that happen again. "I'm going to keep you safe," Jake promised. "No matter what happens, I'm not going to let them take you." The battle between the consortium and Blackstone ships was intensifying, with both sides taking significant damage. Jake could see that one of the consortium vessels had suffered critical damage to its engines, while two of the Blackstone ships were leaking atmosphere from hull breaches. "Commander Chun," Jake transmitted on the general frequency, "I have information about Blackstone Industries that you need to hear. They're running slave operations throughout the Outer Rim, disguised as relocation programs." Chin's response was interrupted by weapons fire as her ship engaged one of the Blackstone vessels. "Captain Morrison, maintain your position. We'll debrief you once we've dealt with these hostiles." But Jake could see that the consortium ships were outgunned. The Blackstone vessels might be outnumbered, but their weapons were clearly military-grade, and their pilots were experienced combat veterans. Unless something changed quickly, Chen's task force was going to be destroyed. Jake made a decision that would probably get him court-martialed if he survived long enough for a trial. "Sarah, target the damaged Blackstone ship," he ordered, bringing his own weapons systems online. "All remaining mining charges, maximum yield." "Captain, engaging in combat against corporate security forces will make you a criminal in 17 different star systems," Sarah warned. "I'm already a criminal in 17 different star systems," Jake replied grimly. "Might as well make it count." The Wandering Star's weapons weren't designed for ship-to-ship combat, but Jake had made enough modifications over the years that they could hold their own in a pinch. His targeting computer locked onto the most damaged Blackstone vessel and fired a spread of mining charges programmed to detonate on proximity. The explosions rocked the corporate ship, overloading its already weakened shields and sending it spinning out of control. Jake could see escape pods launching as the crew abandoned ship, but the vessel itself was finished as a fighting unit. "Unknown vessel. This is Commander Chun," came the transmission. "Identify yourself and explain your actions." "Captain Morrison, Wandering Star," Jake replied, already targeting the second Blackstone ship. "I'm a guy trying to keep you from getting killed." Chen's laugh was audible over the communications channel. "In that case, Captain Morrison, you're welcome to continue rendering assistance." The combined fire of the consortium task force and the Wandering Star quickly overwhelmed the remaining Blackstone vessels. Within minutes, the engagement was over, leaving space filled with debris and escape pods. "All ships, this is Commander Chun," came the transmission. "Secure the area and begin rescue operations for survivors." "Captain Morrison, please prepare to receive a boarding party for debriefing." Jake activated his ship's docking systems and began the process of powering down weapons. He knew that the next few hours would determine whether he was treated as a hero or a criminal, and everything would depend on how much the Consortium Intelligence Service already knew about Blackstone's operations. "Crix," he called over the ship's internal communications, "the fighting is over. You can come out of the medical bay if you want." The young Zephyrian appeared on the bridge a few minutes later, moving carefully on his injured leg, but looking much healthier than when Jake had first found him. The proper nutrition and medical care had worked wonders, and Crix's large eyes were bright with curiosity rather than fear. "Jake won the fight?" Crix asked, looking at the tactical display with fascination. "We won the fight," Jake corrected gently. "It wasn't just me. We had help from good people who want to stop the bad ships. Crix studied the display for a moment before asking, "What happens now? Will Crix be safe?" Jake was about to answer when Sarah announced the arrival of a consortium shuttle at their docking port. Through the view screen, Jake could see a tall woman in intelligence service uniform approaching with a small escort of armed Marines. "I don't know what happens next," Jake admitted to Crix. "But I promise you that whatever happens, you won't be alone. I'll make sure you're taken care of." Commander Chen entered the bridge a few minutes later, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the ship's modifications and equipment. She was younger than Jake had expected from her voice, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of confident bearing that came from years of command experience. "Captain Morrison," she said, extending her hand in greeting. "I'm Commander Chun, Consortium Intelligence Division. I understand you have information about illegal activities in the Outer Rim." Jake shook her hand, noting the firm grip and direct gaze. "More than information, Commander. I have a witness." Chen's eyes shifted to Crix, who was watching the exchange with obvious interest. "And this is the witness?" "This is Crix," Jake said, placing a protective hand on the young Zephyrian's shoulder. "He was a passenger on one of Blackstone's slave ships. He can tell you exactly what's been happening to the missing colonies." Chen knelt down to Crix's eye level, her expression softening as she addressed the young alien. "Hello, Crix. I am Sada. I know you've been through something terrible, and I want you to know that you're safe now. Would you be willing to tell me about what happened to your family?" Crix looked up at Jake, who nodded encouragingly. "Crix will tell Sarah about the bad ships," the young Zephyrian said solemnly. "Crix wants to help rescue family and friends." As Chun began her gentle questioning, Jake found himself impressed by her patience and skill. She clearly had experience dealing with traumatized witnesses, and she managed to get Crix to recount his story without re-traumatizing him. The picture that emerged was even worse than Jake had imagined. Blackstone wasn't just raiding individual colonies. They were running a systematic operation that had displaced hundreds of thousands of people across dozens of star systems. The profits were apparently so enormous that they had been able to corrupt significant portions of the consortium bureaucracy. "Captain Morrison," Chun said after Crix had finished his account, "you've stumbled into the middle of the largest criminal conspiracy in consortium history. Blackstone Industries has been under investigation for months, but we've never had a witness like Crix before." Jake felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. "So what happens now? To Crix, I mean." Chen's expression became thoughtful. That depended partly on him. Crix's testimony could be instrumental in bringing down Blackstone's operation and rescuing the people who have been taken. But it would mean testifying before tribunals, possibly for months. Crix stepped forward, his young face determined despite his obvious fear. "Crix will testify. Crix will do whatever is needed to help family and friends." But he looked up at Jake with large, trusting eyes. Can Jake stay with Crix? Jake saved Crix when no one else would. Crix trusts Jake. Chen looked between Jake and Crix, clearly understanding the bond that had formed between them. "Captain Morrison, how would you feel about working with Consortium Intelligence? We could use someone with your skills and your knowledge of the Outer Rim." Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering the offer. Working with the Consortium would mean giving up his independence, but it would also mean legitimacy and the resources to help people like Crix. "What about my cargo?" he asked finally. "I've got medical supplies and food synthesizers that the outer colonies desperately need." Chin smiled. "Consider it the first shipment in your new career as a Consortium intelligence operative. Those supplies will be delivered where they're needed most." Jake looked down at Crix, who was watching him with hopeful eyes. The young Zephyrian had lost everything, but somehow he had maintained his faith in the possibility of goodness in the universe. Jake realized that he wanted to be worthy of that faith. "All right, Commander," Jake said, extending his hand. "You've got yourself a new agent. But I have one condition. Crix stays with me. He's been through enough upheaval for one lifetime." Chen shook his hand, her grip firm and confident. "Agreed. Welcome to the team, Agent Morrison. And Crix." She turned to the young Zephyrian with a gentle smile. "Welcome to your new family." As the Consortium task force began the process of securing the area and gathering intelligence from the captured Blackstone personnel, Jake realized that his life had just changed completely. He was no longer a smuggler operating in the shadows. He was now part of the fight to expose and destroy the criminal conspiracy that had torn apart so many lives. But As he watched Crix exploring his new surroundings with curiosity rather than fear, Jake realized that some changes were worth making. The young Zephyrian, who had been saved by a simple chocolate bar, was about to become the key witness in bringing down one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the galaxy. And Jake Morrison, former smuggler and current Consortium intelligence agent, was going to make sure that Crix got his chance to save his family and friends, just as Jake had saved him. 6 months later, Jake Morrison stood in the witness gallery of the Grand Tribunal Chamber on Consortium Prime, watching as the final verdict was delivered in the case of Consortium Intelligence versus Blackstone Industries and associated criminal enterprises. The chamber was packed with reporters, government officials, and survivors of the slave trading operation that had been uncovered thanks to Crix's testimony. The young Zephyrian sat beside Jake, no longer the frightened, malnourished child he had been when they first met, but a confident 12-year-old who had become something of a celebrity throughout the Consortium. On the charge of conspiracy to commit crimes against sentience, the Chief Justice announced in her solemn voice, "We find the defendants guilty on all counts." A cheer went up from the survivor section of the gallery, and Jake felt a deep satisfaction as he watched Director Walsh and his co-conspirators being led away in restraints. The investigation that had begun with Crix's chocolate bar had eventually exposed a criminal network that reached into the highest levels of Consortium government and corporate leadership. On the charge of operating unlawful slave trading enterprises across 17 star systems, the justice continued. "We find the defendants guilty on all counts." More cheers erupted from the gallery, and Jake noticed several survivors wiping tears from their eyes. For many of them, this moment represented the first real justice they had seen since their lives had been destroyed by Blackstone's operations. Crix tugged on Jake's sleeve, his large eyes bright with excitement. "Jake, does this mean the bad people will never hurt anyone again?" Jake smiled down at his young companion, still amazed by the resilience and optimism that Crix had shown throughout the long months of investigation and trial. "It means they're going to prison for a very long time, buddy. And it means that all the people they took are going to be found and rescued." The final phase of the Blackstone investigation had indeed led to the discovery and liberation of thousands of enslaved beings across dozens of worlds. The rescue operations were still ongoing, coordinated by a joint task force that included Consortium intelligence, humanitarian organizations, and volunteers from across the galaxy. The tribunal hereby sentences the defendants to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, the Chief Justice announced. Additionally, all assets of Blackstone Industries and associated companies are to be liquidated, with proceeds going to victim compensation and rescue operations. As the formal proceedings concluded, Jake and Crix made their way through the crowds toward the exit. They had been scheduled to attend a reception with other key witnesses and investigators, but Jake could tell that Crix was getting overwhelmed by all the attention and noise. "Agent Morrison," called a familiar voice from across the crowded corridor. Commander Chin approached them with a warm smile, her intelligence service uniform crisp and professional as always. Over the past 6 months, she had become not just Jake's supervisor, but also a close friend to both him and Crix. "Commander," Jake replied, shaking her hand. "How does it feel to have wrapped up the biggest criminal conspiracy in Consortium history?" Chin's smile became thoughtful. "It feels good, but it's also sobering to realize how much damage they were able to do before we stopped them. If you hadn't found Crix when you did, she didn't need to finish the sentence." Jake knew as well as anyone that without Crix's testimony, Blackstone would have continued operating for years, possibly decades. The young Zephyrian's courage in testifying had literally saved hundreds of thousands of lives. "Any word on the colony rescue operations?" Jake asked. "Better than we had hoped," Chin replied, her expression brightening. "We've located and liberated 87% of the missing populations. The rehabilitation programs are working well, and most people are choosing to return to their original colonies rather than accept relocation." Crix looked up at Chun with an expression that Jake had learned to recognize. The young Zephyrian was working up the courage to ask about something specific, something that had been weighing on his mind. "Commander Sarah," Crix said quietly, "has there been any news about Crix's family?" Chin knelt down to Crix's eye level, her expression gentle but serious. This was the question that Crix asked every time they spoke, and Jake knew that Chin always gave him an honest answer, even when the news wasn't what he wanted to hear. "We've rescued most of the people from Colony 7, Chun said carefully. "Your parents are safe and healthy, and They're currently staying at a rehabilitation center on New Zephyr. They've been asking about you constantly. Crix's eyes widened with joy and hope. Crix can see them. Crix can go home. If that's what you want, Chen replied. The rehabilitation center has excellent facilities, and your parents would love to see you again. But she glanced up at Jake before continuing. You should know that your parents have been told about everything you've been through, including how Jake saved you and how brave you've been during the trial. They wanted me to give you a message. Chen pulled out a small recording device and activated it. Suddenly, the corridor was filled with the voices of two adult Zephyrians speaking in their native language, their words filled with emotion that transcended any language barrier. Jake's universal translator kicked in after a moment, providing a running translation of the message. Our brave little Crix, we are so proud of how strong you have been. We know that Jake Morrison saved you when we couldn't, and we will be grateful to him for the rest of our lives. We love you so much, and we cannot wait to hold you again. Crix was crying openly now, tears of joy streaming down his blue-gray cheeks. But when he looked up at Jake, his expression was conflicted. Crix wants to see Mama and Papa, but Crix also wants to stay with Jake. Jake is family too now. Jake felt his own throat tighten with emotion. Over the past 6 months, Crix had indeed become like family to him. The young Zephyrian had brought a sense of purpose and meaning to Jake's life that he had never experienced before. The thought of saying goodbye was almost unbearable. Hey, Jake said, kneeling down beside Chun so that he was at Crix's eye level. Just because you're going to see your parents doesn't mean we won't see each other anymore. I'm still going to be working with Commander Chun, and there are a lot of rescued colonies that need help getting back on their feet. I bet I'll be visiting New Zephyr pretty regularly. Crix's expression brightened slightly. Jake will visit. Jake will still be Crix's friend. Always, Jake promised. You saved my life just as much as I saved yours, you know? Before I met you, I was just a smuggler who didn't care about anything except making money. You taught me what it means to have a family worth fighting for. Chun stood up and placed a gentle hand on both of their shoulders. Actually, I have a proposal that might solve this problem. Jake, how would you feel about being assigned as the liaison officer for the New Zephyr Rehabilitation Program? It's a permanent posting, and it would involve coordinating relief efforts for all the rescued colonies in that sector. Jake looked at Crix, whose eyes had gone wide with hope and excitement. The position that Chan was describing would allow him to continue his work with Consortium Intelligence while staying close to Crix and his family. It was more than he had dared to hope for. I think that sounds like exactly the kind of job I've been looking for, Jake said, smiling as Crix threw his arms around him in an enthusiastic hug. As they made their way toward the transportation center to begin the journey to New Zephyr, Jake reflected on how much his life had changed since that day in the abandoned mining station. A simple chocolate bar had started a chain of events that had brought down a criminal empire, rescued hundreds of thousands of enslaved beings, and given him a family he had never known he wanted. The transport ship that would take them to New Zephyr was a sleek passenger liner, nothing like the rough cargo haulers Jake was used to flying. As they settled into their seats for the 3-day journey, Crix pressed his face against the viewport, watching the stars stream past as they entered hyperspace. Jake, Crix said thoughtfully, when Crix sees Mama and Papa again, Crix wants to tell them about chocolate. Crix wants to share Jake's gift with them. Jake smiled, remembering the wonder in Crix's eyes when he had tasted chocolate for the first time. I think they'd like that. And I've got plenty more chocolate bars where that one came from. Crix giggled, a sound that still filled Jake's heart with warmth every time he heard it. Jake always has the best gifts. But Jake gave Crix more than chocolate. Jake gave Crix hope when Crix had none. Jake gave Crix family when Crix was alone. As the transport ship carried them toward New Zephyr and the reunion with Crix's parents, Jake realized that the young Zephyrian was right. The chocolate bar had been just the beginning. What had really mattered was the decision to care about someone else, to put their needs above his own safety and comfort. In the months that followed, Jake threw himself into his new role as liaison officer with the same passion he had once reserved for smuggling runs. The rehabilitation programs on New Zephyr became a model for similar efforts throughout the consortium, and Jake found himself coordinating relief efforts for dozens of worlds. Crix's reunion with his parents had been everything Jake had hoped for and more. The young Zephyrian's courage and resilience had made him something of a hero among his people, but he remained the same curious, optimistic child that Jake had first encountered in that abandoned mining station. Jake visited them regularly, and it wasn't uncommon for him to find Crix sharing chocolate bars with other young refugees, telling them the story of how a human stranger had shown him kindness when he needed it most. The simple gesture had become something of a legend among the rescued populations, a symbol of hope and cross-species cooperation. One evening, as Jake was preparing to leave after one of his visits, Crix's father approached him with a small, wrapped package. "This is for you, Jake Morrison," the elder Zephyrian said in carefully practiced Standard Galactic. "A gift from our family to yours." Jake unwrapped the package to find a small sculpture carved from blue crystal, depicting a human and a Zephyrian child sharing food. The craftsmanship was exquisite, and Jake could see his own face and Crix's reflected in the polished surface. "It's beautiful," Jake said, genuinely moved by the gesture. "Thank you." Crix's mother stepped forward, her large eyes filled with the same warmth and intelligence that Jake saw in her son. "You gave us back our child, Jake Morrison. You gave him hope when he had none, family when he was alone. This is how we will remember you, as the human who proved that kindness is the most powerful force in the universe." As Jake flew home that night, the crystal sculpture secured carefully in his quarters, he thought about the chain of events that had brought him to this point. A simple chocolate bar had indeed changed everything, not through any special power of its own, but because it had represented something much more important: the willingness to see someone else's need and respond with compassion. The galaxy was still a dangerous place, full of threats and challenges that would require vigilance and strength to overcome. But Jake had learned that the greatest strength didn't come from weapons or technology. It came from the bonds between sentient beings, the willingness to help each other regardless of species or background. And sometimes that willingness began with something as simple as sharing a chocolate bar with a hungry child who had lost everything but his hope in the goodness of others. In his final report on the Blackstone case, Jake wrote, "The investigation began with a single act of kindness and ended with the liberation of hundreds of thousands of enslaved beings. This case demonstrates that the most important intelligence-gathering tool we possess is not technology or surveillance, but our fundamental commitment to treating all sentient life with dignity and compassion." The young Zephyrian witness who made this case possible taught us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what is right despite that fear. His example should guide us in all our future endeavors. The report was filed in the Consortium Intelligence Archives, where it would serve as a training example for future agents. But for Jake Morrison, the real lesson was simpler and more personal. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is offer a chocolate bar to someone who needs it, and be prepared for that simple gesture to change both your lives forever.